It is the 7th of June 1832. The British monarch signs into being one of the most important acts in parliamentary history, the Great Reform Act, widening the franchise to voters across the realm and laying the foundations of true parliamentary democracy. Little over a year later, the same monarch gives royal assent to the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, instantly outlawing servitude across a quarter of the globe. However, these revolutionary acts were not signed by famous monarchs such as George III or Queen Victoria, but by one of Britain's most unfairly forgotten kings. His name? William IV, ruler during Britain's most revolutionary reign. The man known to history as William IV, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and King of Hanover, was born very early on the 21st of August 1765 at Buckingham Palace in London, then known as Buckingham House. His father was King George III of Britain and Ireland. At the time of William's birth, George had ascended to the throne 5 years earlier in 1760 at 22 years of age. He was the third of the Hanoverian kings of Britain and Ireland. These were a German dynasty that had ties back to the English House of Tudor and the Scottish House of Stuart. William's father was the first king of the House of Hanover to have been born in England. The German origins of the family meant that the kings of Britain and Ireland in the 18th and early 19th centuries also ruled over the large principality of Hanover in northern Germany, a region where William would have a significant impact one day. William's mother was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She and George had only married in 1761 after he became king. The union resulted in a very large brood of children. 2 boys, George and Frederick, were born in 1762 and 1763 before William. This was significant, as it meant William was third in line to the throne and considerably less likely to succeed to the throne one day as a result. George, Frederick, and William would have many further siblings. George III and Queen Charlotte had 15 children in all, most of whom lived into their 60s and 70s, an unusually high survival rate and life length for a family in the 18th century. It was a relatively warm family life, with George and Charlotte's marriage being particularly close, though it became troubled over time owing to George III's illness. William grew up in a time when Britain was emerging as a great power. It was not always so. In international terms, during the late medieval period, England was a small backwater kingdom on an island on the periphery of Europe. A hypothetical visitor to 17th century England from somewhere like Mughal India or Qing China would have found England to be a poor, rural country with only one major city, London. Yet England was already starting to punch above its weight by that time, establishing colonies in North America and the Caribbean, and sending out trading missions to the west coast of Africa and to India and the East Indies. It was also acquiring considerable wealth through its role in the slave trade in the Atlantic. Efforts to curb and ban that same trade would feature heavily in William's life and reign. Britain's global impact was accelerating rapidly right around the time of William's birth. In the late 1750s, the English East India Company had successfully conquered much of Bengal and northeastern India, paving the way for the creation of the British Raj over the next century. The Royal Navy was emerging as a global naval power. 3 years after William was born, James Cook would set off on his voyage to the South Seas, laying the foundation for British colonization of Australia and New Zealand, while the Industrial Revolution was about to begin from around 1770 onwards. Essentially, William's life would span the period in which Britain moved from being an emerging European power to one which ruled over a global empire. There was a conflict at the heart of this British ascent, and it was one which would shape William's life in many different ways between his youth and his later life. This was Britain's rivalry with France. By the middle of the 18th century, France and Britain were both trying to colonize the same parts of the world. The British had their 13 colonies in North America from New England south to Georgia, while the French had their colonies in Louisiana and New France, or Canada. Both countries had acquired some of the Caribbean islands, and they were vying for influence in India. In Europe itself, Britain had led alliances alongside powers like the Dutch Republic and Austria, which had withstood French efforts to dominate Western Europe for decades. This rivalry was so intense that historians now talk about a second 100 Years' War, one which ran from 1688, when the 9 Years' War broke down, to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and which was actually much more intense than the first 100 Years' War, fought between England and France between 1337 and 1453. Britain had won the latest round in this clash at the time that William was born. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, 2 years before William's birth, and at the end of the 7 Years' War, had seen the French cede Canada to Britain and accept British ascendancy in northeastern India. However, there was a growing discontent amongst the colonial population of the 13 colonies in North America about the nature of crown rule here, and when war broke out there in 1775, the French soon intervened to undermine the British. William would play a role in the later stages of that conflict, and his life more generally was lived in the shadow of near constant war between Britain and France. William's early life was spent in a range of households being raised by different governors and tutors, as was the way with royal children at the time. When he was 7 years old, he was sent to have his own household at Kew Green on the outskirts of London. Major General Boudet, a Swiss commander from the Army of Hanover in northern Germany, and Dr. James Magendie were entrusted with William's early education between age 7 and 13. Boudet and Magendie were relatively competent, though hardly imaginative in their schooling methods, and William has never been mistaken for being a particularly cultured monarch. He was educated alongside his 2 younger brothers, Edward and Ernest. The 3 boys fought. Edward was aloof and the more intelligent of the 3, Ernest disagreed with both the others, and William was impetuous. Discipline was strict, as was common even for royal children being educated in the 18th century. Beyond this, William grew up to be quite close to his sister Augusta, born 3 years after him. Inevitably, with a large coterie of 15 children born over a space of more than 2 decades, William had very different relationships with some of his siblings. He was, by all accounts, the favoured brother of his sisters, perhaps because, unlike virtually all of his male siblings, William had an easygoing amiability and was usually quick to apologize if he wronged someone in even a slight manner. It might seem unusual by today's standards, but William's father took the decision to send him off to sea with the Royal Navy in 1778 when he was just 12 years old. A number of factors account for this. Firstly, the concept of being a teenager is a construct of the Victorian age. In the 18th century and before it, people largely perceived that boys and girls began to enter adulthood once they were 13 or 14 and were expected to take on adult responsibilities in tandem. Therefore, sending William off to sea on the cusp of his 13th birthday was not as unusual for the time as it might seem. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, William's eldest brother, George, was already demonstrating the wayward personality that would so trouble his father for decades. George III wished to get his other elder sons away from the Prince of Wales and ensure that his drinking and carousing did not rub off on the other boys that might themselves potentially become kings of Britain one day. Thus, in June 1778, just before his 13th birthday, William was shipped off to join the Royal Navy. At the time, his father, the king, wrote to Sir Samuel Hood, then a commissioner of the dockyards at Portsmouth, though later head of the Mediterranean fleet of the Royal Navy, to instruct him that William was to be, quote, received without the smallest marks of parade. The young man goes as a sailor, and as such, I add again, no marks of distinction are to be shown unto him. William was to be treated as every other sailor. George's best-laid plans could never find purchase, though. Everyone knew they were interacting with a boy who was third in line to the throne. He would probably never be king, but it was not out of the question. William's early service focused on the war in North America. At the time he arrived to Portsmouth, Britain was already mired in war with the colonial community in North America and the French, yet again. The American Revolutionary War was entered into in April 1775, as the patriots in New England and elsewhere became unwilling to pay ever-rising taxes imposed by William's father's governments without political representation of some kind. The conflict was at its very height in 1778. The American victories at the battles of Saratoga the previous autumn had made it clear that the Crown risked losing control of the 13 colonies entirely, while the French had entered the war on the side of the Patriots early in March 1778 and were now providing extensive naval assistance to the rebels. After a year of training, William was assigned as a cadet to the Prince George, the flagship of Admiral Robert Digby, in June 1779, a few weeks shy of his 14th birthday. His earliest service involved escorting British merchant ships in the Eastern Atlantic as they were attacked by French ships of the line and the Spanish, another ally of the Americans. He saw hot action against a flotilla of Spanish ships in January 1780 as Rodney tried to break through with his own ships to resupply the British position at the Rock of Gibraltar, a British possession since the War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 18th century. While at the Rock, William ended up in a brawl with another soldier and was briefly imprisoned. Nevertheless, when he returned to England after the Gibraltar mission, he was celebrated for his role in the enterprise. When the Prince George returned to active duty in 1781, it was on an altogether different mission. This time, it was bound for North America, and William spent several months thereafter stationed in the port of New York City, which was still under British control in the later years of the American Revolutionary War. William's appearance in North America was viewed as an opportunity by the head of the Continental Army, George Washington. At the time William arrived to the colonies, the war between the British Crown and the colonials was entering a pivotal stage. It was evident by then that the British could not win an absolute victory, but the exact nature of the peace remained uncertain. William happened to arrive to New York City, one of the last major Crown strongholds in the colony, in September 1781, right as the Siege of Yorktown, the last major clash of the American Revolutionary War, was beginning to the south in Virginia. Washington's intelligences soon brought him reports that the son of George III was walking around Manhattan pretty much unguarded. William spent much of his time on board ship in the harbor, but occasionally he went on shore, often visiting the house of Commodore Edmund Affleck when he did. Washington was provided with a plan to kidnap William while he was on an excursion to Affleck's house. He approved it, despite the fact that the Siege of Yorktown had just ended after a British surrender, and peace negotiations were now accelerating in France. The future First President of the United States seems to have sanctioned the mission on the basis that William could be used to secure the release of numerous colonial prisoners of war. The plan was ultimately foiled, though. The British appear to have got word of elements of the plan and increased the security around William and his movements in New York. Despite being foiled, the plot is an interesting interaction between the man who became the first President of the United States a few years later and a future King of Britain. George III had apparently sent his third eldest son off to sea at such a young age in order to train him to play a very senior role in the British Royal Navy one day, perhaps as an admiral or even as Lord High Admiral, if everything went according to plan. It was a well-laid plan for a son who it was assumed would never be king, but it was never to be fully realized. William spent the rest of the 1780s serving at sea. It was not an inspiring record that he developed. He became a relatively competent officer and was eventually given command of his own small ship. However, try as his father might have done to ensure that William was not given preferential treatment, his superiors were always aware that he was the son of the king. Without constructive criticism of the kind few were willing to give him, his abilities as a seaman could only reach a certain point, and William was not disciplined enough to apply himself. Like his brothers, William also developed a penchant for alcohol at an early age. This was not the kind of drinking that was commonplace amongst many early modern people. William engaged in heavy drinking. Later in life, when his nephew-in-law, the future King Leopold I of Belgium, with whom William was dining at the time, asked for some water to be brought to the table, William stated, perhaps somewhat ironically, that he did not approve of people drinking water when he ate with them. This fondness for alcohol got him in trouble at sea. While at Halifax in Nova Scotia, in what is now Canada, in 1788, he fathered a son with an unknown woman there and was rumoured to have visited every brothel in the town during drunken evenings in port. He was also insubordinate. His conduct while in port in Barbados in the Caribbean in the mid-1780s, where he smashed up a brothel during a drunken night out, would have earned him a court-martial if he were anyone else, and in 1787 he wrote an astonishingly petulant letter to Hood when he became convinced he was being skipped over for promotion. Hood sent a civil response and ignored the problem. By the time of the clash between William and Hood, who by then was commander at Portsmouth and on his way to being one of the most senior naval commanders in Britain, William's time at sea was coming to an end, at least for the time being. After a final tour of the Caribbean in 1788, where he spoke in favour of the maintenance of mass chattel slavery as the basis of the sugarcane economy there, he returned to England. There he was made Duke of Clarence on the 1st of May 1789. This was a prestigious title, one which had been held in previous times by Lionel, Duke of Clarence, one of the sons of King Edward III in the 14th century, and a son of King Henry IV. The awarding of the title to William came after a peculiar incident in which William had seemingly tried to hold his father and the government to ransom by expressing an interest in joining the House of Commons. This was surely a calculated piece of blackmail to ensure he was given a prominent noble title and was allowed to join the House of Lords. It was considered unseemly for a member of the royal family to even countenance joining the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament. No member of the royal family had ever sat there, and in suggesting he would try to gain a seat in the Commons, William was attempting to embarrass the government into giving him what he wanted. By now nearing his 24th birthday, he was also given a pension of £12,000 a year to support himself and his household staff and set up with apartments in St. James's Palace. In the House of Lords, he began to align with the more liberal Whigs. In this, he was following the example of his older brothers, much to their father's annoyance, who was, at heart, a supporter of the Tories. William's flirtation with entering the House of Commons had come at a time when neither his father nor the government in general needed such petty distractions. In the summer of 1788, George III had begun acting in a peculiar fashion. Not long afterwards, the Parliament had been prorogued for several months, with those aware of the situation hoping that this would provide time for the king to rest and recover from whatever was ailing him. He did not. Instead, his condition deteriorated further, and by the late autumn matters had reached a crisis point. The cause of George's affliction has been widely discussed for over 2 centuries, yet never concretely resolved. During his bouts of illness, he became manic at times and then pensive and depressed on other occasions. Sometimes he would talk incessantly for hours, but not in a conversational manner. The most plausible explanation, based on reports of his urine being severely discoloured in later years and the nature of his symptoms, is that he was suffering from porphyria, a liver disease. This was leading to a build-up of toxins in his system that caused him to descend into periods of mania. The Regency crisis of 1788 resolved itself early in 1789, when he seemed to make a full recovery, and the bill, which government ministers had been preparing to allow the Prince of Wales, William's brother, to rule in his father's stead, was shelved. Yet it was not the end of the problem. King George's bouts of mania and illness would return on numerous occasions and, as we will see, they eventually led to his reign effectively ending in 1810, 10 years before his death. Not long after his father's recovery and his brief efforts to enter the House of Commons, William began a relationship with an Irish woman by the name of Dorothea Bland. She hailed from Waterford in the south of Ireland, though she had spent most of her life in England and had become a figure on the London stage. As an actress, she had changed her name to Dora Jordan, evidently deciding that Bland was not a suitable surname for a thespian. William's relationship with a commoner was controversial and the subject of numerous satirical cartoons in the British newspapers in the 1790s. It was also not his first unconventional relationship. As we have seen, prior to meeting Jordan, while he was away at sea, he had fathered an illegitimate child, the mother of whom is unknown today. Named William after his father, this son would drown while serving in the Royal Navy off Madagascar in 1807. In 1791, over the protestations of his mother and father, William settled down at Clarence Lodge in Roehampton with Jordan, married in all but name. Later, they lived at Bushy House in Teddington in London in the 1800s. They would have 10 illegitimate children, each of which was given the surname Fitzclarence, Fitz meaning son, and Clarence being a reference to William's senior-most aristocratic title. This was an established practice for illegitimate royal children. Illegitimate sons and daughters of previous monarchs, for instance, were given the name Fitzroy, effectively meaning son of the king. William and Dorothea's large family would fare well. The eldest, George Fitzclarence, was made Earl of Munster in 1831. A daughter, Sophia, married the Baron de Lisle and Dudley. Another son, Adolphus Fitzclarence, became a rear admiral in the Royal Navy. William was a complex individual. He was not as difficult to figure as his eldest brother George was. The future George IV was an alcoholic and a deeply irresponsible individual in many respects. However, William had his own issues. Friends and acquaintances described him as hard-headed and obstinate when he had a firm view on a matter. He could also become impatient easily. At the same time, he had a kind of humility and disliked decorum in a refreshing manner for a member of the royal family, something which he probably acquired from his mother. He was a xenophobic individual. Years later, when he became king, he insisted on replacing many of the royal staff with English men and women. In this, he was shaped by his experiences in North America, where he developed an antipathy towards the colonial community, and also by the prevailing anti-French sentiment that was common in England during the 18th century. Contemporaries referred to him as Silly Billy, though this was probably unfair. While he was not possessed of a great intellect, William was not unintelligent either. A prevalent issue surrounding him was his indebtedness during the 1790s and 1800s. Much of this was owing to his personal reckless spending during these years, though a fair share of the blame lies with Dorothea as well. Many years later, when they separated and he married, he turned himself around in this respect and became a model of financial restraint amongst the royals. While William was settling down with Dorothea as his mistress in the 1790s, Europe was descending into complete and utter chaos. Ultimately, what was occurring would see Britain emerge victorious against the French in the Second 100 Years' War that William had played his role in during the 1780s in North America. While French involvement on the side of the Patriots in the American Revolutionary War and the emergence of the independent United States had been a great coup for the French against the British, financing it had added to an economic crisis that had been brewing in France for decades. This climaxed in the late 1780s as harvest failures and other issues ensured that King Louis XVI had no option except to convene the Estates General, the French Parliament, for the first time in 175 years. When it met in the summer of 1789, the French Revolution soon began, as the king and his ministers quickly lost control of the situation and were sidelined by the Third Estate. The revolution became more and more radical in the early 1790s. Two things led to a descent into a general European war. Firstly, there was an unwillingness amongst powers like Britain to accept such a radical political experiment in a country like France, one which many feared might act as an inspiration to the commons of countries like England to revolt against their own governments. Secondly, Queen Marie Antoinette of France was an Austrian princess and had effectively been under house arrest in Paris since the autumn of 1789. The Austrians consequently led the formation of a coalition which, in 1792, went to war with the French. This was the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. These would eventually morph into the Napoleonic Wars, which in turn lasted down to 1815. Thus, a quarter of a century of William's life, as for all Europeans, was lived in the shadow of the French Revolution and the wars that followed. When Britain joined Austria and Prussia in their war against France early in 1793, there were questions as to whether or not William would return to sea. His younger brother Edward chose the option of military service during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, serving in North America throughout the 1790s, and then being appointed as governor of the British fortress at the Rock of Gibraltar in 1802. In contrast, William did not take up a naval position in 1793. This was partly owing to a self-inflicted injury. William had recently fallen down a staircase while drunk and broken his arm. The greater reason, though, was that the head of the Admiralty, Lord Hood, with whom William had clashed back in 1787, simply did not want William to be given a naval command. It would politicize the Navy to an overt degree, and there were also serious competency issues. Hood and others who knew William from his time serving in the 1780s quite simply did not believe he had the makings of a good admiral or captain. The excuse Hood and others needed for this decision was provided in 1793 when William gave a speech in the House of Lords in which he spoke in a veiled way against British involvement in the war, a view held by many Whigs in England at the time. Thus, although his father pushed for it, George was effectively blocked from returning to active service at sea during the French Revolutionary Wars. On this count he hardly merits the name the Sailor King, which some contemporaries and many historians have bestowed on him. That said, he did continue to play a role in naval matters from dry land. During the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars, William acted as a patron of numerous seamen, Lord Nelson included, and he would eventually, after many years of seeking a senior naval position, gain appointment as Lord High Admiral much later in his life. The French Revolutionary Wars eventually gave way to the Napoleonic Wars in the late 1790s. The change came about as one of the many prominent French generals that emerged in the 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized control of the French Republic late in 1799. He established what was known as the First Consulate. It was a military dictatorship in all but name. Later, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in 1804, and in the years that followed, conquered virtually all of Europe, leaving Britain and Russia as the only countries that had not been fully reduced to French domination. As all of this occurred, the position of the Royal Navy became more and more important. A French invasion of Britain or Ireland could only be staved off at sea and might have come about had it not been for Nelson's great victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Watching all of this, William periodically expressed a desire to return to sea and at one point petitioned for command over the Mediterranean fleet. His efforts were blocked yet again. Meanwhile, his debts continued to grow, compounded by the fact that Dorothea, who had a successful career as an actress for many years, was no longer in demand on the London stage to any great degree, and her spending had become much greater than her own income. By the end of the 1800s, it was clear that William was considering marriage to a wealthy heiress to relieve his financial position. Parliament certainly would not help him any further at a time when the indebtedness of George III's many children had led to political resistance to using the public purse to aid them in their financial distress, particularly so in a time of war. 1810 and 1811 were tumultuous years for William and his family. The youngest of William's sisters, Amelia, had been in poor health for many years. In 1809 and 1810, matters deteriorated further, and she died on the 2nd of November 1810 at 27 years of age. Her deteriorating health devastated her father, who slipped into another bout of mania and incapacity in October 1810, shortly before Amelia died. He never recovered from this. George III would spend the last 10 years of his life in a world in which he did not recognize reality. His eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, formally became regent and began ruling on his father's behalf in 1811. This situation would prevail for nearly 10 years, down to 1820. Not long afterwards, on the 23rd of December 1811, a formal deed of separation outlining the financial provisions of their split was agreed upon between William and Dorothea. After 20 years and no marriage, they went their separate ways, even as the pressure on William to finally marry was growing. She would eventually move to France and died there in the summer of 1816. That she was able to do so points to the other major development of these years, the end of the wars with France. Napoleon overstretched his hand when he invaded Russia in 1812, and his continental empire collapsed in 1813 and 1814. After a brief return to power in the spring and summer of 1815, he lost power for the last time after the Battle of Waterloo. William was made an admiral in the later years of the war, but it was in a purely ceremonial capacity. In 1818, William finally married at 52 years of age. There were numerous reasons for this belated decision. His long-standing mistress, Dorothea Jordan, had died in the summer of 1816 from a ruptured blood vessel. Much more consequential was the death, on the 6th of November 1817, of Princess Charlotte, the daughter and sole heir of Prince George. Even though George III still had 12 living children, Charlotte was his only legitimate surviving grandchild at that time. Thus, if William or one of his siblings did not begin producing children within wedlock, there was a possibility the family line would die out one day. The responsibility for saving it fell primarily to the male members of the House of Hanover, as most of the childbearing years of William's sisters were behind them by that time. Parliament even offered financial incentives to William and his brother Edward if they would marry, and so, on the 11th of July 1818, the pair married in a joint ceremony at Kew Palace in Surrey. William's bride was Adelaide of the House of Saxe-Meiningen in central Germany. At 25 years of age, she was less than half William's age. The union proved a reasonably good one. She had a stabilizing influence on William. He drank less, and they moved for a time to the Hanoverian lands of the family in northern Germany, where they lived frugally as William tried to live within his means for once. Alas, the one thing the marriage did not result in was healthy children. Adelaide had a tumultuous natal history over the first 5 years of their marriage. A daughter born in March 1819 lived only a few hours, and there were several stillbirths and miscarriages. The closest they came to having a healthy child was Elizabeth, who was born in December 1820, but died the following spring. William and Adelaide were going through this unpleasant experience as the situation with the succession was changing again. On the 29th of January 1820, William's father died at 81 years of age. Old King George III had not ruled in nearly 10 years and had spent most of his later years in a shadow world, conversing with people that were long dead. With his death, William's brother finally ascended as King George IV in his own right. By the time his long-delayed coronation took place on the 19th of July 1821, tongues were already wagging about how long the new king would be around for. George IV was an alcoholic who, by the time he became ruler of Britain, was suffering from a range of associated illnesses, not least obesity. He had no heir since the death of his daughter in 1817, and was unlikely to produce one now. If George died, the throne would pass to William's other older brother, Frederick, but his marriage had proved childless, and so William was the second in line to the throne from 1820 onwards. Frederick's health was also poor, and many people now viewed William, whose adoption of a healthier regimen was in direct contrast to the physical decline of his brothers, as a man who might become king sooner than expected. Despite the changed state of affairs, William and Adelaide continued to elope from England regularly, spending protracted periods of time on the continent in 1822, 1825, and 1826. In April 1827, well over 3 decades after his desire to return to sea had been frustrated at the start of the French Revolutionary Wars, William was finally granted the high naval office he had always coveted. The Prime Minister, George Canning, Viscount Melville, extended an invitation to become Lord High Admiral of Britain, effectively the head of the Royal Navy. Perhaps Canning had an eye to currying favour with the man who might soon be king, but the Prime Minister himself died just months later. The post of Lord High Admiral had been in abeyance for a time, and reviving it was a political gesture. William's patent of office restricted his powers by forcing him to consult with an Admiralty Council before any major decisions could be taken. Even with these restrictions, William immediately plunged his office into some controversy when he praised Sir Edward Codrington for sinking much of the Turkish fleet at the Battle of Navarino off the western coast of the Peloponnese in the Mediterranean. Codrington had acted without official orders, and his actions dragged Britain into the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. When Britain's wartime hero from the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, entered office as Prime Minister in January 1828, he pointedly referred in his first speech to the action at Navarino as a, quote, untoward event, something of a rebuke to William. When William exceeded his remit again months later, Wellington intervened with the king, and George IV wrote to his brother telling him he would have to act more within the constraints imposed by his patent of office. William was upset, but he thereafter turned with some success to administration. It was he, for instance, who, as Lord High Admiral, commissioned the building of the first steam-powered ship of the Royal Navy. He also introduced some reforms to the gunnery system. Part of the decision to appoint William as Lord High Admiral in 1827 was because by then he was even closer to the throne. His older brother, Frederick, the heir to the throne since 1820, died on the 5th of January 1827 of a combination of dropsy and cardiovascular problems. It was clear George would not long outlive him. He had been increasingly consigned to bed for days at a time, was obese, suffered from a range of ailments, and was also going blind. He was also managing on a diet of laudanum for his various ailments, and could barely function as monarch. It was consequently not surprising for William when he was woken by an attendant at Bushy House around 6 a.m. on the morning of the 26th of June 1830, and was informed that he was King of Britain. George had died not long before at Windsor Castle. William was an initially popular monarch. He was, after all, succeeding a recluse whose private life had been controversial for decades. Yet William made efforts to boost his popularity. He opened some of the Park of Windsor to the public for the first time, and not long after his accession held a banquet for 3,000 of the town's poorer inhabitants. His wife's reform of the ostentation he displayed earlier in his life continued, and he managed to reduce the cost of the royal establishment by half. His austerity was such that his coronation, when it was held on the 8th of September 1831, cost just about 10% of the amount George had spent a decade earlier. William loathed ceremony and had wanted to dispense with the event altogether, though he was informed that it was a constitutional requirement. At 66 years of age by then, William was the oldest monarch of England or Britain, crowned until Charles III's coronation in 2022. One of the first major acts of William's reign was to play a role in the Belgian Revolution. There had never been a country of Belgium prior to the 19th century. The lands here had comprised several important medieval duchies and counties in the Middle Ages, such as the County of Flanders, the County of Hainaut, and the Duchy of Brabant. These were conquered by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 14th and 15th centuries. After the Burgundian state dissolved on the extinction of its royal line in 1477, the provinces had passed through the hands of the Spanish and Austrian branches of the House of Habsburg. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Austrian Netherlands, as they had been known for most of the 18th century, were handed over to the Dutch House of Orange-Nassau, effectively as part of the Netherlands. Rule by the Protestant Dutch never suited the Catholics of Belgium, and in August 1830 they revolted and established their own state, naming it after the Gallo-Celtic Belgae tribe that had controlled the region prior to the arrival of the Romans there in the 1st century BC. To fully resolve the question of Belgian independence, the London Conference was staged in December 1830. Belgian independence was agreed to in principle by the great European powers, but a further question was, who would rule over it? William was a strong advocate for the cause of Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was the widower of Princess Charlotte, William's niece, who had died in childbirth back in 1817. Leopold had remained living in England after her passing. Now he benefited by having his cause promoted by his uncle-in-law, and in 1831 he ascended as Leopold I, King of the Belgians. At home, William had adopted a fairly chaotic political situation. By the early 19th century, some of the broad outlines of the modern British democratic system were in place. The Crown no longer ruled the country. Parliament was in charge, and the executive was headed by a Prime Minister and a cabinet of ministers. However, the monarch of the day still had a much greater role in appointing the Prime Minister than is the case today. A series of strong prime ministers like Robert Walpole and William Pitt the Younger had characterised British politics for much of the 18th century. Since the end of Lord Liverpool's 15-year tenure of the office in April 1827, there had been a much more unstable situation. George Canning and Frederick John Robinson came and went in quick succession before Wellington entered office. He was still there when William became king. However, Wellington was a less capable politician than he had been a military commander, and was replaced in November 1830 by Earl Grey, who, in turn, was followed by Viscount Melbourne, Wellington again, and finally Robert Peel, all in quick succession in 1834. In the midst of this rapid turnover of prime ministers, William intervened in 1834 to try and influence parliamentary politics by dissolving the government after John Russell succeeded Lord Althorp as leader of the House of Commons. The king disagreed with Russell's views on the collection of tithes and ecclesiastical taxes in Ireland, where the so-called tithe war was underway, and was reluctant to have him become the leader of the Commons. The move was not shrewd. It is the only time in Britain's modern history that a British monarch has intervened to dissolve a government in this way based on his own personal views. William's actions have not been repeated since. It did, however, pave the way for the rise as Prime Minister of Robert Peel, who became the leading British statesman of the middle of the 19th century. In the midst of this rapid turnover of prime ministers and shifting political landscape in the first half of the 1830s, a number of extremely important pieces of legislation passed through the British Parliament. These were the results of decades of campaigning and lobbying, and it was somewhat coincidental that they passed into law in the early 1830s. The first of these was the Great Reform Act. While Britain was a democracy of a kind by the start of the 19th century, it remained an oligarchic one. Few people were allowed to vote. Women were entirely excluded, and only men of certain wealth and social status could vote. This was epitomized in the existence of rotten boroughs. In these, the average person was so poor that they did not qualify to vote, often meaning that MPs were elected for these constituencies with virtually nobody there actually voting for them. The Great Reform Act of 1832, which William gave royal assent to on the 7th of June that year, was a major milestone in the shift towards Britain becoming a full democracy. The income and wealth requirements were considerably reduced, expanding the number of men that could vote in elections. It paved the way for the additional Reform Act of 1867, which would see millions of people voting in Britain in elections for the first time. William was an inherently conservative monarch and was no great fan of the Great Reform Act. It is to his enduring credit that he facilitated the passage of the Act all the same. When it was proposed to him late on in the process that he could block it by creating new peers who could then block the legislation from passage through the House of Lords, he refused to do so. The entire process, though, was very chaotic, with riots occurring in 1831 in London, Derby, Bristol and Nottingham when the second bill of the Act failed to pass through Parliament. Hundreds died and millions of pounds worth of damage was caused in a serious bout of civil unrest. The other major legislative development of William's reign concerned the institution of slavery. For 3 centuries, the transatlantic slave trade had been a feature of English and British life. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, slave traders like John Hawkins emerged, who transported slaves from Western Africa to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Over time, the English had become much more deeply involved in the trade after they established their own colonies in North America and above all in the Caribbean in the 17th century. The War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the 18th century had even led to the British acquiring the asiento, the right to supply the Spanish with slaves in the Americas. Villages like Liverpool and Glasgow were transformed into major trading cities as a result of their role in the slave trade, while the capital generated by the production of sugarcane in the British colonies in the Caribbean funded the early Industrial Revolution to a not insignificant extent. Despite the enormous financial benefits reaped from it, in 1807 the British Parliament had passed the Slave Trade Act. This led to a ban on the trading of new slaves in British ships. It still did not go far enough for the abolitionists, and in 1833 the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, banning the slave trade altogether throughout the British Empire. Over the next half a century, the British Royal Navy even began policing the world seas in an effort to stop other nations engaging in the slave trade. Though William was the monarch who gave the royal assent to the Slavery Abolition Act on the 28th of August 1833, his personal attitude towards slavery was not exactly enlightened. Years earlier, during his time in the House of Lords, he had spoken on several occasions against the abolition and had referred to leading members of the abolitionist movement as fanatics. In 1799, he had referred to slaves in the Caribbean as living in, quote, a state of humble happiness. He had also visited the Caribbean in the 1780s during his naval career and was on good terms with the planter community there. This planter community was central to why it took 26 years for the ban on the slave trade to be extended to a ban on the institution of slavery altogether. William was on very good terms with the West India Committee, a pressure group set up back in 1780 to resist abolition, and he was an important figure in calling for extensive compensation for the planters in the Caribbean who would be impacted on by the abolition. Eventually, the British government agreed to pay out £20 million in compensation, billions of dollars in today's money. William might have given the royal assent to the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833 as part of his constitutional duties, but he was opposed to it on a personal level. William was involved in important constitutional developments as well on the continent. Since the accession of King George I as the first ruler of the House of Hanover in Britain in 1714, the rulers of Britain had also been the rulers of Hanover in northern Germany. This was a peculiar constitutional arrangement. The Hanoverian monarchs ruled over Hanover, yet Hanover was not controlled by the British state. Thus, Hanover was broadly ruled by William as a separate state in the 1830s. There was unrest here at the time of his accession about the political situation. The burgeoning middle class of industrialists, professionals and business people were unhappy about the very limited number of nobles in Hanover failing to share a political power with them. The opposition continued for several years until William oversaw the adoption of a new constitution for Hanover in 1833. This agreed to share a greater amount of political and economic power out amongst the Hanoverian bourgeois. William's greater legacy in Hanover was to be remembered, and he is marked as the last ruler of Hanover who was simultaneously King of Britain and Ireland. When he died in 1837, he would be succeeded by his niece in Britain. As Hanoverian law forbade a female from succeeding to the throne, Ernest Augustus, William's younger brother, instead succeeded as King of Hanover, splitting the British and Hanoverian thrones, although they continued to be ruled by members of the House of Hanover down to the formation of the German Empire in 1871. It might stretch matters to suggest that William was a major patron of British culture during his 7-year reign. His older brother, for all his many faults, was a relatively cultured individual, something of a dilettante amongst the otherwise culturally disinterested late Hanoverian monarchs. William did not emulate him. This stemmed from his own personal habits. Some of William's favourite reading material, for instance, included lighthouse manuals and dense tomes about naval history, ever trying to present himself as the Sailor King, even decades after he had last been to sea in any sustained way. It should come as no surprise, then, to learn that he did not act as a major royal sponsor of writers, artists, or librarians. Nevertheless, the 1830s were a comparatively important period in British cultural output. It was, for example, towards the end of William's reign that a young Charles Dickens published his first works, Sketches by Boz and The Pickwick Papers. Alfred Tennyson continued his emerging career as a poet laureate of 19th century Britain. The utilitarian philosophy movement was at its peak in the final years of the life of Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, while his successor, John Stuart Mill, began formulating his thoughts in the 1830s. The painters J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, two of the paragons of mature landscape painting, both completed some of their best work during William's reign. Constable was present at the King's coronation. William might not have been a cultured enough man to have tried to promote these individuals or to try and patronize the development of their less successful peers who were in need of financial freedom in order to be able to write, think, and paint, but he also did nothing to impede on the press freedom that had developed in Britain during the 18th century. Many works which would have been blocked by royal censors on the continent in the 1830s were made freely available to the reading public in William's Britain. William's last years were considerably unhappy ones on a personal level. Most who knew him agreed that William was a good father to his children, yet many of the 5 sons and 5 daughters that he had with Dorothea Jordan were unhappy with their status after he became king, particularly his eldest son from that relationship, George Fitzclarence. In an effort to assuage his son, William created him as the first Earl of Munster in 1831 and made him a Privy Councillor 2 years later. Still, George remained unhappy, and a rift developed that was compounded by the fact that George was suffering from increasing mental instability, which was probably created by an inherited form of porphyria, of the kind which seems to have led to William's father's psychological decline from the late 1780s onwards. The pain of the rift between father and son grew when William's favourite daughter, Sophia, died in childbirth in April 1837. At almost exactly the same time, William, who was asthmatic, suffered a severe attack. His physicians revealed that his lungs seemed to be full of blood, and his heart was possibly going to give out. Nevertheless, he fought on for 2 more months, like an old lion, as the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli described it. He lived long enough to celebrate the 22nd anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. However, things were bad enough that day that he was given the sacrament. 2 days later, William died at Windsor Castle at 71 years of age. After lying in state, he was laid to rest in the vault of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. While none described William as a great monarch at the time, there was much talk of the integrity he had restored to the monarchy after the crisis of the Regency and then his brother George's less than ideal reign in the 1820s. Although William had a large number of children during his lifetime, he had outlived many, and those that were still alive were all illegitimate, born outside of wedlock, and unable to succeed him to the throne. Therefore, he was not to be succeeded by any of his children. Moreover, despite the fact that William's father and mother had produced a very large number of children back in the 1760s and 1770s, there were very few plausible heirs left to claim the throne when William died in 1837. Indeed, the foremost claimant was William's young niece Victoria, who had only just turned 18 years of age. Victoria was the daughter of William's younger brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. Edward had enjoyed a long military career on land and had remained a bachelor for much of it, all things which echoed William's own life. Like William, Edward had finally decided to belatedly get married in 1818 for reasons which also mirrored William, namely the need to secure the royal line by producing heirs. Unlike William, Edward's marriage to Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld did result in an heir, a girl named Victoria, after her mother. Thus, on the death of William, young Victoria ascended to the throne, her claim being stronger than William's surviving siblings, each of whom were born after Victoria's father, making their lines more junior in the line of succession. She would rule for the next 63.5 years, the longest reigning monarch of Britain up to that time and the second longest after Queen Elizabeth II. Such was the imprint of her reign that the era is known as the Victorian Age, one in which the British Empire was at its absolute height and its power stretched around the globe. William's short reign has always stood very much in the shadow of his more exalted niece. William IV is one of England and Britain's most obscure monarchs. He was never expected to rule. He had two older brothers, George and Frederick, both of whom survived the dangerous years of infancy and childhood when so many people died in early modern times. Once they grew into adulthood, in an age of rapidly improving life expectancy, it was assumed one of them would father numerous children, and then there was no real chance that the throne would ever pass to the third of George III's sons. Consequently, William spent much of his early life as a seaman, serving in North America and elsewhere as a young man in the 1780s, and then as a patron of the Royal Navy at home in England during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of the 1790s, 1800s, and 1810s. William did not even feel the need to marry and sire his own legitimate children. However, it gradually became clear as the years went by that he might become king after all, particularly so after the death of his niece, George IV's only daughter, Charlotte, in 1817. And so it was. George and Frederick died without heirs, and William became king in 1830. As a man ascending the throne in his mid-60s, his reign was always going to be a short one, but it was not an inconsequential one. In his 7 years on the throne, William oversaw the abolition of the slave trade, though he cannot be given credit for it in any way, and also gave the royal assent to the Great Reform Act of 1832. On the international stage, he played a role in the emergence of the Belgian state, and his reign was important in terms of sundering the monarchical ties between Britain and Hanover. That he is a forgotten monarch today is primarily because he is entirely overshadowed by the 60 and 63-year-long reigns of his father and niece, George III and Victoria, which came closely before and immediately after his own reign. What do you think of King William IV? Was he a fairly forgettable monarch? Or should he be viewed more in light of his naval career and his life prior to assuming the throne? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.